If someone were to ask you, what are the top 5 things that I can do right now to live a brain healthy lifestyle? What would you recommend to me?
I had a gut feeling about this. That term
Uh,
means a lot. And the brain gut connection as well. So, we know that it's bidirectional, that's for sure. How interesting it is that highway,
yeah.
bidirectional highway, is bringing unique things from the gut, actual physical things. Not just electrical signals are
Right.
making their way to the brain, like a protein called alpha-synuclein.
There is so much new research around the lymphatic system and the immunology of the brain that is so tied into these chronic degenerative neurological diseases. And as humans, we can affect the immunology of our brains by our everyday actions. Dr. Perlmutter, I've so enjoyed getting to know you over the last year or two since we've met.
Yeah, we're new friends.
We're
It's
new friends.
yeah, hasn't been going on that long, but I've enjoyed every minute of it.
Same, same. You've just been so gracious and a man of many talents. Like you've surprised me every time I see you and I talk to you. I heard about your amazing boat trips that you take. You're a fisherman. You're an incredible singer, guitarist. Just mind blowing.
Well, that's into my own mind.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we do enjoy our boating. So,
Yeah.
at this stage of life, it's really great to be able to dedicate to really reconnecting with um, just the solemn aspects of being alone and really getting back to nature. It's
Right.
so helpful.
It's something that's often ignored in many people's lives until they feel the negative effects of not doing it for years and years and years. And if there's one thing I've learned is that your brain, it kind of waits a long time before it tells you something bad is happening. But you really got to start earlier managing the inputs into your brain.
Well, then two thoughts
Yeah.
come to mind. That's kind of redundant. Where do your thoughts come to anyway? But this morning about 6:30 in the morning, we were at the hotel where we were staying, and I was on a yoga mat outside.
Mhm.
It was a beautiful sunrise, and you could still see half the moon, or the moon in half phase. And you're right; it's about reconnecting. It really spoke to me about
Mhm.
embracing me and welcoming me back. So, you're right, though. We tend to distance ourselves. We get on the treadmill and want to accomplish this and that, and it's that reconnection that really is very, very important.
Really, at what point in your life did you find yourself reconnecting with nature, reconnecting with your soul?
Well, let me answer that by saying I remember the point that I realized I was not connecting.
Yeah, when was
And I
that?
was in the on-call room during my surgery internship,
Mm,
looking out a non-openable window,
mm,
and I said to another resident, "I missed the weather.
mm,
I missed, I just got really tired of the climate control."
right.
So I vowed that, I was going to work hard to do my thing for a period of time, but never be in a situation where I was really distant from weather and from experiencing the changes in the weather. Not that I was at that time thinking about how that clues my physiology, which
Sure.
we know it does, but just because it was just so speaking to me, so much connection, and I felt viscerally that it was a good thing.
That's amazing. I mean,
Yeah,
gosh, I'm kind of envious because I realized this probably 25 years after medical school
yeah.
and residency that this disconnection is having negative effects, not just in my physiology, but also in my mentality. And now, of course, I'm getting back into reconnecting with nature, reconnecting with my soul and my purpose. But it took me a long time. And so I think, for this podcast, especially for the younger listeners out there, just make it something you think about. I think
Yeah,
is
I mean,
right.
we can even look at the fractal implications of the term you just used,
Yeah,
connection and
right.
disconnection. From the level of being disconnected from the goals of our DNA, wanting us to
Sure.
have longevity and be healthy, long health span and lifespan,
Uh-huh.
all the way up to the disconnection that we have with the planet and the
Oh,
disconnection that we have from each other. So,
yeah.
we can unpack that for hours and look at the nuances of that term. But I think the notion of connectivity is something at multiple levels that we need to foster. And I suspect we'll talk about that today.
Yes, I think there's going to be a major highlight, and we'll double click on that for sure. Um, so You've had such an incredible career. You've been such a prolific author. I've learned so much from you over the years, especially, my journey in functional medicine only just started. I feel relatively young in this field about 10 years ago. And by then, you've already had 8 years ago, many books out, and I've read many of them. And in preparation for this podcast episode, I pulled them off my shelf and I
Oh,
looked at
good.
some of the highlights that I've made. And some of your newer books that you've written with your son are just incredible, and they really speak to kind of our modern day environment. And then I got to thinking, like, how much things have changed over the last 50 years in our environment, and just the things that we're exposed to, the inputs into our brain, nutritionally, sleep wise. I think a lot has changed in 50 years. And I was born 52 years ago, and obviously I've noticed the change, but I think you have more experience and you've really looked at it from a lens of how has this affected our brain. And I'd love to talk about that, because I think it has a lot to do with evolutionary biology, what we've evolved, what our brains have evolved to be able to deal with versus not. And I would love to hear kind of your journey through the last 30, 40 years in medicine, and kind of how you think our environment have changed and how that's affected our brain.
Well, that's a broad subject, that's for
Yeah.
sure. I think that for your audience, my foray into neurology
Mhm.
was very much towing the line. And so I was in a very mainstream neurology
Yeah.
practice with two partners, and did the night call, did the clinic day in and day out, and basically at one point about 10 years into that, a couple things happened. Our kids were at an age where I just felt like I was not spending enough time with them and really wanted to. I was missing them.
How old were they?
I'd say Austin was probably 9, Rachel was
Yeah.
about 7, so they were.
So my kids are 10 and 7 right now,
There we go.
and I'm feeling I really relate to this because I
Yeah.
feel that. I feel it deeply in my heart and my soul. So I get it.
Well, and I remember I was talking to. I started to look at things, and I had a dinner with a fellow by the name of Dr. Bernie Siegel,
Mhm.
and he was really a trailblazer. I think he was one of the founders of the American Holistic Medical Association. A Yale-trained general surgeon, a terrific guy. Wrote a book called Love, Medicine, and Miracles. And matter of fact, I spoke to him about a month ago. And he said, well, I'm now about himself, I'm now in the meaning part of life.
Oh,
And I think in contrast to what? Probably the achievement part of life. And I was thinking, well, gee, what's it going to take to transition to the meaning part of life? And I think it's the meaning part of life is when you can start to dedicate your thought processes and your energy to exploring what's it all about? What is the meaning of life? As opposed to achievement, financial security, raising the family, all those things. So I realized at that point that will come with time, and it eventually did come. But I did realize, though, that that's not going to be binary. It's going to be gradual. And so here we are 10 years into this practice where I had a revelation really one day that I was treating symptoms only, whether it was Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, headaches, MS. I was treating symptoms, and that's it. And we had brought somebody in, a new after his residency partner, and he jokingly said one day, "I'm stamping out disease." And I chuckled, and I realized as I was driving home, I thought about that statement. No, we're not.
no.
We are not attacking disease in the least bit. And I started to broaden that thought process and realize that we don't have, even to this day, Darshan, we do not have any drugs, for example, to treat diabetes or to treat hypertension.
Right.
We treat the manifestations, we treat the symptoms, we treat
Right.
the smoke, and we ignore the fire.
Yeah.
And your viewers may be surprised when they hear, well, I'm taking a blood pressure pill, I'm taking a diabetes pill, whatever it may be. And what I'm saying is those will lower blood pressure and lower blood sugar, but stop the medication, and a day or two later, your blood pressure, blood sugars are going to go up.
Right.
So you really have not approached treating the underlying problem, you're treating symptoms. And I think, to be fair, that there's no field of medicine that is more entrenched in this notion of trying to validate the idea that that's good medicine than neurology.
I agree with you. Yeah.
And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I think it's really very helpful to provide a medication to a Parkinson's patient, for
Sure,
example,
sure.
to allow him or her to reduce his or her tremor or rigidity. That's a
Right.
great thing. But to completely ignore the underlying disease process, which has until quite recently, and we're going to touch upon this because it's absolutely in an area that I know you're interested in. We've had nothing to treat the underlying disease
Wow.
process,
Mhm.
and years ago, 18, 20 years ago, I began exploring something called glutathione, an
Yes.
antioxidant,
Yeah.
in treating the underlying disease process in
Mhm.
Parkinson's. And we published our results in the journal Movement Disorders. And we finally were able to reduce people's progression
Mm.
on what is called the Unified Parkinson's
Right.
Disease Rating Scale, a measurement of how good or bad a patient is doing. So that was important for me, and I realized I wasn't going to be able to pull that off in the practice. That several things actually coalesced at the same time.
Mm.
My mentality changed in terms of what I wanted to emphasize. And one other interesting sidelight was at that point, there were class action lawsuits against the manufacturers of silicone breast
I
implants
remember that whole
because
fiasco.
women were getting a host of issues.
Right.
And one of the areas in which they were becoming compromised, when they became compromised, was neurological issues.
Oh.
All kinds of neurological issues, even pretty devastating
Yeah.
situations. So I became qualified in America as the only board-certified neurologist who was qualified as an expert to testify in the cases of these women.
Mhm.
And beyond testifying, I was qualified then to examine them, create a report that they could then use in the class action suit. And as such, my practice began seeing these women, several a day. And interestingly, part of the evaluation on my perspective was a breast exam, as one might
Mhm.
expect, to determine, does it appear as if the implant has ruptured? Does it appear as if there's troubles in the lymph node,
Sure.
spread of the silicone to lymph node, or reactive changes in the lymph nodes in the armpit, or whatever it was?
Right.
And that just was too much for my partners, that a neurologist would be examining women's breasts.
Yeah.
So it became clear that it was time for Dr. Perlmutter to move on.
Mm. Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, feel your pain there because I also, when I started my medical career, was in a very traditional practice, and just even thinking outside of the box was you were ridiculed probably sometimes, or they were just like, "What are you doing?" Or it makes no sense in the traditional people, and it's so interesting to me how entrenched they get in that mindset too. It's just mind blowing to me.
Yeah, and you're right. You're thinking outside the box,
Right.
and that's what makes it exciting. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
But as I've said before, that the mission is not to think outside the box and behave outside the box. It's to make the box bigger.
Yeah.
It's to really do your best to make it clear that the things that we are doing are valid, are scientifically validated, and are good for people and achieve some positive outcome. And I won't forget that during this period of reflection and trying to chart a new course, that my wife and I went to a really cheap hotel that was the only thing available on Sanibel Island. My office manager watched the kids, and I was thinking, I said, I'm going to leave this practice. And we both were walking down the beach. It's nighttime. And the conclusion was, what's the worst that could happen? That was the question we asked ourselves. How bad could it get? And, you were saying it was hard to make the decision and all that. It was not. I've always been one to just leave the skis pointing straight down the mountain. And don't worry about carving and edging. Just go straight down. Let it go. I mean, it's going to be okay. Do what you love, and good things will follow.
Mhm.
So that allowed me to transition and I began exploring all kinds of interesting things. Some were valid and, stood the test of time. Some did not. But I absolutely would not have had it any other way because it's been a very, very exciting ride. Continues to be a very exciting ride. And I'm sure for the next several decades, it'll continue to be inspiring, challenging, and hopefully provide, new information for people.
Yeah, I love it. And, I think as I look through the kind of the journey you've taken in your book writing, you addressed an issue that was very timely in that moment. So with Grain Brain, for example, it seemed like, at least to me from an outsider's perspective, that people were just really confused about the connection between gluten and inflammation and brain health. And the way you broke it down in that book, it really made a lot of sense to me as a physician. And I was appreciative that you were able to tell the story to just the general public as well. So I think you changed a lot of lives. You probably saved a lot of lives as well. And I just wonder, you emphasize the negative effects of gluten on the brain. Was the impetus to write that book something that you saw happening in our environment, and specifically with the dietary recommendations of the United States government, or how did that come about?
That's a great question, and I will preface that question, the answer to the question, by indicating. So I got out here for your podcast yesterday. I had some
Yes.
free time at the hotel out by the pool, and for the heck of it, I decided. The question I put into ChatGPT 4.0 was, how have the ideas presented in Grain Brain in 2013 stood the test of time?
Mhm.
And it was very encouraging, very validating that the ideas, Grain Brain was mostly about the threat to the brain of carbohydrates,
Right.
of which many are related to gluten being wheat based, and there's added threat to the brain in a lot of people, not all people. So it was very encouraging to read that, and it was interesting because I got into the hot tub then, and there was a woman in the hot tub. Turned out she was a writer for New Yorker magazine,
Wow.
and
Only in LA does that happen,
oh, it was
or maybe
great.
New York
Well,
too.
it could be, and she had the New Yorker right there, which is fun to read, especially
Yeah.
the comics and cartoons. I said, well, I've written a few things in my day as well. She said, oh, what do you write about? I said, health. Her first question was, I've been reading a lot lately about the impact of sugar on the brain, and there's some relationship between sugar and Alzheimer's. What an idea! You ever heard of that? And it's just how things go, right?
Right.
How things are set up like that. It's good for you though to realize there's an undercurrent of destiny in
Yeah.
life, and when you just take a deep breath and watch it happen, it's pretty exciting. So,
Yeah.
what was the impetus, to get back to your question,
Yeah.
for writing a Grain Brain? It was at that time I was beginning actually to make a connection between things going on in the gut and the brain,
Mhm.
recognizing that risk for autoimmune conditions, for example, was certainly a lot higher in people who had gut disorders,
Mhm.
well beyond the genetic predisposition. There's something relating, strangely enough, the gut, which lived in Chicago, to the brain that lived in Paris.
Mhm.
I mean, how these things seemingly so disparate, yet relationships were starting to appear. And, certainly the talk of the town, this was on the heels of a book by William Davis called Wheat Belly.
Mm.
The talk of the town was really about wheat and gluten. And he was talking about weight loss and inflammation.
Right.
And when you get to the part in Wheat Belly that talks about inflammation, oh, that lights up something for me, because at that point we were really understanding that inflammation is kind of a cornerstone mechanism related to brain degeneration. And since that time, that's been amplified to include mental health disorders as well. But that said, I started connecting dots between the gut, gluten, inflammation, and the brain, and did the research, and that was the genesis of Grain Brain.
Mm.
And it sure pushed a button. I mean,
Yeah.
it sure it sure helped, I believe, a lot of people. Got translated into 32 languages around the world. So it was a great experience for me too, to explore that science, to really start to cultivate a lane for myself,
Sure.
and be pretty much the only individual in that lane for a long time. Ultimately joined the Institute for Functional Medicine,
Yes.
and there was a committee of functional medicine neurologists, and I was the president of that committee,
Ah.
the vice president, the secretary, and the only member for an awful long time.
Right.
And then with time, Terry Walls came along, other neurologists began to, and when you think about it, functional medicine is the perfect place for a neurologist.
Right.
But neurology has always been sort of off-putting to physicians because for whatever reason, we could talk about it, but hasn't been something that everybody's gravitated to. But I'm
Right.
always fascinated by it.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by the brain, but then going through medical school and then going to residency, I just remember thinking neurology really was just about, figuring out if someone had a stroke, what part of the brain did that stroke occur in based on their symptoms? And if someone has Alzheimer's or if someone has Parkinson's, what are the medications you can use to treat it? And it was just kind of like this black box up here,
Yeah.
right? Not connected to the rest of the body. And so connecting it to the rest of the body, in the way functional medicine has and the way you have, has been a complete game changer once you realize it's part of this entire system.
It is not separate. It's not
Yeah.
disparate. And the main thing I think that we were trained to do in residency and even in practice is name the problem,
Right.
or determine where it was in the brain, localize it. And once high quality scanning came along, that part of the
Right.
task was taken away from us, and then just naming it. And truthfully, the treatment options could be spit out on a card you carry in your pocket.
Yeah.
And what's the challenge? What's the academic, intellectual challenge of doing that? You become an automaton,
Yeah.
and that was not fulfilling.
Right. Exactly. And I think the intersection, I have so many thoughts on this, but the intersection between neurology and psychology now as well, I feel as though now that we understand this functional medicine approach to our entire body, that intersection is very much blurred as well, because the same root causes that are causing brain degeneration, Parkinson's disease, etc., are the same causes of psychological illness, things like depression, anxiety, etc. Do you agree with that? Or
Oh, fully. And
Yeah.
I think that, and I know you have an upcoming podcast with Austin Perlmutter,
Yes.
Dr. Perlmutter, our
yes,
son.
yes,
So, and I'm sure you'll unpack that, but I think it's quite clear that mechanistically, the same things are going on in mental disorders as we see in the degenerative issues. And in neurology and other aspects of medicine, we have two types of people. We have lumpers and splitters. We have splitters who want to delineate each and every disease and create an understanding of those diseases and their treatment protocols that are very, very unique for not just
Yeah.
not just depression, but this type of depression. Whatever the ICD codes look like,
Yeah.
there's going to be a unique accepted practice for the treatment of that disorder, as opposed to the lumpers who try to lump everything together and, as we're talking about now, recognize that underpinning these disorders are mechanistically shared types
Right.
of biochemistry and pathology.
Right.
And that's really good because it can be taken beyond the brain. It can ultimately, and as you know in the work that you're doing,
Absolutely.
involves the entire body.
It does. Yeah.
The notion of a heart smart diet, for example, well, what's the effect of the heart smart diet on the brain? The idea is that there is indeed good and bad recommendations from a dietary perspective that are beneficial for the immune system, the heart, the brain, the bones, and all aspects of health, because that's how our physiology
Right.
works.
Right.
So people say, well, gee, what are the best things you could be taking for your brain? Well, we've already talked about what's good for your heart, and so we could just extrapolate. But that said, so in many ways, what's exciting at this stage of life for me, and I'm glad I haven't gotten a Lifetime Achievement Award, because the moment you get that Lifetime Achievement Award, that's they put you out to the pasture.
Yeah, you're like, you're done.
Wait a couple of decades for that. But
Right.
what's exciting is that there have been a lot of hanging chads in my mind to try to understand things. Sure, we understood that problems with energy production in the brain are seen in Alzheimer's. We've understood that people with type 2 diabetes have a higher risk for developing Alzheimer's. We've understood that inflammatory markers are higher in the blood and spinal fluid in patients with Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative conditions. We've understood more recently that metabolic issues in general kind of presage the development of brain disorders, degenerative disorders. But what's exciting now is from the lumper perspective or grouper perspective, not referring to the fish, is that across the spectrum of neurodegenerative conditions, MS, Huntington's, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and so many others, these mechanisms are common, are shared.
Right.
Therefore, it allows us to look upon this shared mechanistic ideology as being a way to cultivate a general plan that's good for everyone to keep their brains healthy on the front end.
Yeah.
You mentioned something earlier about, what happens when, the brain starts going bad. And I was about to interject, but I thought that would be rude.
You can interject anytime.
No, that's fine. But, what we understand is that when we see the clinical manifestations, even the very earliest manifestations of Alzheimer's, clinically, i.e. memory or executive function, dysfunction, memory compromise or executive function compromise, that this is an indication that issues began with that person's brain 20 to 30 years before.
Right.
That's, if we ended our interview right now, that would be a good bullet point to take
Exactly.
home.
There's such a key factor.
Yeah.
Our brain is better than any other organ in our body at masking disease
Yes.
and showing us symptoms late. And like you said, if you're going to take away one thing, put a pin in that, because what you do today, if you're 20 years old, is affecting your brain until you turn 50, 60, 70, and then you'll see the
Yeah, and
see the
you were leading
manifestations.
into that. We were talking about
Exactly.
environment. Has our environment changed the last 50 years?
Right.
Because it seems like people are manifesting.
Right.
So there's a big push in the neurology journals and the throwaway journals. The throwaway journals sort of look like they're academic, but they're really kind of advertorials.
Advertorials, right?
There's a real push to embrace these, these early biomarkers for Alzheimer's to detect it early. And great, if you want to talk about it, spend your time looking at that, great. And the next paragraph is the reason we'd like to have them is because then we can start treatment earlier when we've biodetected it at an earlier stage. Okay, what does that mean? There is no treatment. So what's all the excitement about these biomarkers if there is no meaningful treatment, which will raise eyebrows amongst your viewers clearly, because we're all hearing about these wonderful drugs, a couple of them that have been FDA approved, that target beta amyloid that are really the cat's meow. They're not. They are incredibly minimally effective, associated with significant side effects, and we can do better. I think it's great that we're finally turning our attention to at least trying to identify the underlying cause of Alzheimer's, for example.
Absolutely.
I don't believe, and many in the field do not, latch on to the notion that it's the accumulation of beta amyloid. It's certainly going on and is roughly related to the progression or even risk, but certainly there are plenty of patients who, on specific types of PET scanning of their brains, have lots of beta amyloid and are cognitively very intact at 70 and 80 years old. Similarly, we see PET scans of individuals with end-stage Alzheimer's who don't have much accumulation of beta amyloid in the first place. So we have to challenge that notion that is the end-all cause.
Absolutely.
Having said that, the fact that there is at least attention to looking at the underlying cause is, I think, important. But again, we're recognizing now, and when I say we, I mean, really leading-edge researchers around the world, that Alzheimer's is a metabolic condition of the brain. It's a manifestation over changes in metabolism over which you and I and every person has control.
Exactly.
That's the empowerment part of the mission. That is that we can rein in our metabolic functionality in our bodies, and that reflects what's going on in the brain because it's part of the body, alluding to what you said earlier. And as such, in that period, 20 to 30 years prior to becoming my age, set ourselves up for a brain that's going to be along for the ride, that's not going to degenerate and leave us hanging with a neurodegenerative disorder.
Exactly. And so I think big picture, what you're saying is, yes, we have these biomarkers now potentially that can detect Alzheimer's early or inflammation in the brain early, but the treatment is still the same. It's reducing inflammation, it's controlling metabolic disease, it's understanding that, and if you do that, the understanding is all of these things will be less prevalent in your life. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, even psychological disturbances can be affected by getting your metabolism under control, getting your inflammation under control.
Yeah, and
Yep.
that has global implications.
Yeah.
And there are 50 million people right now globally with Alzheimer's. I think the number's got to be much higher than that.
Sure, it seems like it's
Think
higher.
of people who are not diagnosed. And,
Mhm.
the statistics show that here in America, our 6.7 million Alzheimer's patients, that number will triple by the year 2050. That's not in the distant future. And what we're seeing is that the future is coming to us a lot quicker than we had
Absolutely.
anticipated,
Mhm.
especially as it relates to a lot of things like climate change. We're reaching thresholds that were predicted to happen in, 2030. Well, that's way off in the distance. Well, it's not. And we've crossed those thresholds already. And I think when you look at prevalence of Alzheimer's and very much Parkinson's, even more so, that those numbers are going up at a rate that's much higher than we had anticipated.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But metabolically, we're going in the wrong direction globally. And, the World Health Organization tells us that the number one cause of death on planet Earth right now, as we have our conversation,
Yeah.
are the chronic degenerative conditions.
Sure.
The diabetes, the obesity, cardiovascular diseases, Alzheimer's disease, and not COVID, not infectious disease, not TB or other transmissible type of issue or trauma. It is chronic degenerative disease that's killing most people on the planet. It's horrible, but we can control that when we get the messaging out that our choices determine whether or not our metabolism is sound or dysfunctional. That can be hugely empowering for the planet. And, interestingly, you were mentioning how I wrote a book with Austin Perlmutter.
Right.
One of the central ideas that we put forth in the book was the relationship between inflammation and metabolic health and our decision-making ability, how we see the world around us. What is our global view? How do we treat?
Is that Brainwash you're
Yes.
discussing?
How do we
Yeah,
treat
that was
other
such a
people?
great book, right?
And when we look around now and see what's going on globally with how people are treating each other,
Right.
what's going on it's devastating. It's a manifestation of where people's mindset is. What is their reality? What are their beliefs?
Right.
And Gandhi said that your beliefs, dictate your thoughts. Your thoughts dictate your words dictate your actions ultimately dictate your destiny. So in a way, beliefs, what you believe, will dictate your destiny. And your mission and my mission is to change people's beliefs as it relates to health,
Yeah.
to offer up that level of empowerment that what you've been told may not be accurate. And what people have been told is to live their lives however they choose, and that modern medicine is going to fix the problem.
Right.
I'm not derogating the wonderful advances in modern medicine, especially lately as it relates to cancer therapy and metabolic therapy,
Right.
I might add. We'll have to open that up.
Yeah.
But I am saying that by and large, we've got to be the architects of our health destiny. And your mission has been to give people those tools, empower them with the knowledge that, the ball is on their side of the court.
Absolutely.
And now you've got to return that serve.
Yeah. I mean, one of the first things I do, we see a lot of patients here at my clinic and we measure a bunch of different biomarkers and everyone wants to know, what do I do with my nutrition? How do I fix my exercise routine, et cetera? What do the tests show? And before we go over a single result, the first thing I say is we're going to have a conversation about your mindset. We need to fix how you think about your health in the first place. And so, I refer back to the book, The Age of Scientific Wellness, about how they need to change their mindset into becoming participatory into this entire journey that they're going to be on. Whereas before, I think, like you said, we're all raised in this world that you don't need to participate. You can do whatever
Yeah.
you want and then let the Western medical care system take care of you when you get diagnosed with a disease. Well, we already said this many times. By then, it's 30, 40 years into the problem, right? And so I wanted to kind of go back to metabolic health because I think that's such an important root cause of disease. In your book, Drop Acid, you mentioned uric acid as one of the indicators or one of the biomarkers that you believe are particularly useful in helping people understand metabolic disease. But was the reason to bring up uric acid a reason to get people to just think about metabolic disease in a global sense, or is there something special about uric acid that you
Both.
believe? Yes.
And the former is really hasn't really been unpacked in any real interview that people have said, was that just your ploy to let people think that, hey, metabolism matters and here's just an entree to that mentality? And it was.
Which is great. I
You
mean,
bet it
like
was. It was a little bit of subterfuge, but you're
right.
exactly right.
But like the thing is that people never really thought about their metabolism. It was never a topic of conversation, their metabolic health. And so I'm glad you wrote the book,
Yeah, and it gets back to medical wellness, the whole
Right.
notion that science is going to be here to take care of us, and we're just waiting for the next medical breakthrough to to extend our life and health span. But the reality is, we labored through this a little bit when continuous glucose monitors, for example, became available from physicians, and there was a big debate as to whether individuals should be able to have that type of information. And now we see, widespread availability of, all kinds of blood results, et cetera, that people can get without medical
CGM
intervention.
just became over the counter.
That's
just
right.
A few
But
weeks ago.
in the earlier stages, which was in recent memory, I mean, we're talking 2 years ago, there were ongoing debates, for example, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, saying that, if people get this information, number one, they're not going to know what to do with it, as if most mainstream doctors do fully understand glucose metabolism.
Right.
And number two, it's going to make people neurotic because they're going to have all this data. And my response was, we shouldn't then, with that mentality, allow people to buy a bathroom scale because they shouldn't know their body weight because they're going to become neurotic and not know what to do with that information. I will agree that, people are confused about what to do with that, about what to do with being overweight. But we see what's happened. And now people are able to avail themselves of an incredibly powerful data set related to this continuous glucose monitor that has immeasurable implications in terms of their current and future health. Just knowing not just your spikes of blood sugar after a particular meal or exercise protocol or lack of sleep or negative interaction with another individual, whatever it may be, but more importantly, what are the dynamics of that blood sugar and what is what we call the area under the curve? Not just what the blood sugar is from time to time, but how much time is it elevated?
Right.
And so, gosh, I think that's an incredibly valuable piece of information. It's breathtaking that people can get that information without having to go through a physician.
Yeah. And to your point, I have hundreds of people on CGMs right now. Not a single person has not known what to do with that information.
Yeah.
Every single one of them eats it up. They want to know, they're monitoring, they're noticing things I wouldn't even think about noticing, like how a walk outside versus a walk inside decreases the area under the curve. Those kind of things, which are just, you got to trust people to know what to do with the data, especially when it applies to themselves, because they're super motivated.
Yeah, it gets back to what you just said. You tell every patient before you look at the labs, that they need to get in the game.
Exactly.
They are, again, the architects of their health destiny. And that level of knowledge is really empowering. So I'm all in.
Absolutely. Your next book, Brain Maker, was also way ahead of its time. A lot of I would say a deep dive into gut health and how that and the microbiome and how that impacts your brain. And I think the gut has always been another black box of medicine, I would say. I remember going through residency and just thinking, why would I ever want to be a gastroenterologist? All you do is colonoscopies all day long.
But think back when you did, like a colonic resection,
Yeah.
or any surgery on the
I did
bowel.
a lot of those.
What's
Yeah.
the first thing that you did? You sterilized the gut with neomycin or whatever it was.
Yeah, we would do bowel preps.
Right,
Yeah.
bowel prep. You sterilized the gut because there'd be no implication of that long term. Why worry about it?
Wow.
Maybe it was good when you were doing the anastomosis to reduce infection rate.
Yeah.
But I think that, gosh, it's so clear that we've been so cavalier with antibiotics
Absolutely.
over time. And, the good news is I think there's a real revelation in the understanding of this relationship between the microbiota and the entire rest of our physiology, both in terms of metabolism and long-term health.
The words gut-brain connection are thrown around a lot. Would you define that to our listeners and kind of how you think of the gut brain connection?
Well, I think it's interesting that we're having a discussion because there's this kind of revelation that the gut is connected to the brain.
Hmm.
Why don't we talk about the gut heart connection, the gut bone
Yeah.
connection, the gut mood connection, the gut
Hmm.
connection to any function in
It's
the in
all
the human body?
interconnected.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the fact that we somehow have segregated the body parts, in a sort of Cartesian way.
Right.
Uh, it's time we recognize that everything is connected to everything else. We talk about here's a term that you're going to love:
Mm.
cardiometabolic health.
Yeah.
Well, why are we locking metabolic health into cardio?
Right.
Why do we not talk about neurometabolic health
Sure.
or metabolic health as it relates to immunometabolism is now an important term. So again, I think it doesn't serve us well to think that this is a revolutionary idea that the gut is connected to the brain. And it is. It's physically, it's chemically, it's spiritually connected to the brain, and the brain then connected to the gut.
Spiritually.
You bet. You
Yeah.
bet. I had a gut feeling about this. That term means a lot.
Mm.
Um, and the brain gut connection as well. So, we know that that's bidirectional, that's for sure. The brain and your thoughts influence what's going on in the gut, the secretion of the hormones, we know that, for example, corticosteroids that your
Sure.
body will create in response to stress has a dramatic effect on um, the functionality of the gut bacteria, their diversity, whether they're able to do good things for you or not, upon which we depend, the chemicals that they produce, the short chain fatty acids, their role in shoring up the barrier, the gut barrier, that when it becomes dysfunctional, sets the stage for Alzheimer's disease.
Right. Right.
So this relationship is profound, and beyond being profound, it provides us an incredible opportunity, a new playing field, as it were. That's what Brainmaker is all about, that we have a new playing field to provide us incredible, unthought of opportunities to help people regain and prevent brain issues, regain brain function, and help prevent brain disorders. So it was very exciting to write that book. And
Yeah.
and like you said earlier about Grain Brain, there was pushback, and my gosh, the gut brain connection, there is no connection. The brain's here, the gut is there.
Yeah.
Why would he say that? So
And I think, when I think about that gut brain connection, another thing I did in surgery a lot was vagotomies. I can't believe we used to do that, but it was the only way to treat like a ulcer in the stomach. And
yeah,
you think of the vagus nerve and the incredible implication, the amount of signals going through the nerve, which 90% of the signal I think goes from the gut to the brain. And we would just cut that in surgery because we didn't know what the vagus nerve really
yeah.
did except make acid
Vagotomy and
secretion.
pyloroplasty,
Right.
that's for sure. But how interesting it is that highway, bidirectional highway, is bringing unique things from the gut, actual physical things, not just electrical signals, are
Right.
making their way to the brain, like a protein called alpha-synuclein that may in fact be stored in the appendix. But this alpha-synuclein makes its way to the brain and is thought to be a fundamental player in Parkinson's disease, such that retrospectively, people who underwent that procedure that you performed,
Right.
vagotomy, ended up having a remarkably lower risk for Parkinson's because the superhighway was closed.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. That is so. And this was in the appendix.
It is
Stored in
thought
the
that
appendix.
a lot of the alpha-synuclein may be stored in the appendix.
Has there ever been a study of appendectomy in
There has
Parkinson's?
been, and it
Right?
looks as if that might be associated with reduced risk of Parkinson's.
That's so.
Yeah.
And it just highlights that how much we don't know.
Yeah.
How many chemical signals, how many molecular signals are there that are going all throughout our body, and the connections that are there is just incredible. We keep learning new signals all the time.
And I have to tell you that over the years, I think back when I began lecturing on these kind of novel ideas, I thought, wow, we are really connecting dots now. We're really gaining, a new frontier of understanding in terms of what's going on. And I realize now that, gosh, there's so much more to understand.
Yeah.
That we're not. People say we haven't scratched the surface. We're not even near beginning that process. It's there's a lot to learn, and that's again what makes it exciting. But as it relates to Parkinson's, that's a metabolic condition.
Right.
One very large study demonstrated that the risk of Parkinson's in type 2 diabetics is increased by about 46%. What does it tell you? It tells you that there's a metabolic component, that the area of the brain that creates dopamine
Mm-hmm.
is one of the most metabolically active parts of the brain. When we threaten metabolism, that's one of the first areas that suffers. Less dopamine produced by the substantia nigra, and then we have these clinical manifestations. It can be induced by metabolic issues. It can be induced by exposure to various environmental toxins. It can be induced, as we saw with Muhammad Ali, by repeated head trauma. There are many entrees to compromising brain metabolism,
Right.
including that are feed forward, that continue on. We see that with this chronic traumatic encephalomyelopathy that football players get. That once they are, once this process has been started, it continues, and it continues because of the relationship between our metabolism and the brain's immune system. And that is what we call immunometabolism. That's what my next book is all about. That's which is called Brain Wars. That's the new horizon.
And I'm so glad you mentioned this, because when you said immunometabolism a few minutes ago, early in the conversation, I was like, wait a minute, I haven't heard you use that term yet in any of your books that I've read. But I did see, I think you wrote a blog about this just recently. Is that right?
I did.
Yeah. And so for people that want more information, we'll link to the blog for sure. But I'm excited to hear that you have a new book coming out on this, because it seems to me there is so much new research around the lymphatic system and the immunology of the brain that is so tied into these chronic degenerative neurological diseases. And we can, as humans, we can affect the immunology of our brains by our everyday actions.
And I think it's important to realize that we have been very myopic as it relates to the term immune system in the brain. I mean, this focuses on a unique population of cells that make up about 10 to 12% of the cells in the brain, called the microglial cells.
Right.
That'll be on the quiz for all of the viewers. But the point is that, we think of immunity, in the context of infectious problems and
Right.
COVID. I want to have a strong immune system so I can fight off these invading pathogens. But in the brain and even in the body, the immune system is doing a lot more. I mean, in the brain, the immune system is deeply involved not only in finding viruses and bacteria and components of these viruses and bacteria and ridding the brain, but nurturing neurons, nurturing synapses, maintaining the integrity of the blood-brain barrier, gobbling up misfolded proteins like beta amyloid. And when this part of the immune system, the microglial cells, transform into another morphology, we call a different phenotype, the very same cell transforms into, it adopts, changes its personality, becomes the evil twin.
Wow.
When it becomes the evil twin, then it hastens the death of neurons. It digests away the synapses, the connections between neurons. It destabilizes the blood-brain barrier. It stops engulfing beta amyloid. It's the same cell. And the shift between being the good twin and the evil twin is governed by the metabolism of that cell. So this is, the spotlight example of immunometabolism. It's how the metabolism of that cell, primarily the function of its mitochondria, and how that determines whether it's the good twin that loves us and nurtures our brains and protects us against Alzheimer's, or the evil twin that hastens the brain's decline.
It's so interesting.
That's the war.
That's the war that's being fought in the brain. And these, in the microglial cells,
That's
are
right.
the immune cells of the brain. And they have so many functions, as we know. Like at night when you sleep, that's what's kind of clearing your brain of toxins. But you're saying that they become the evil twin if their metabolism is not on point.
And brain metabolism obviously reflects systemic metabolism. And becoming metabolically compromised. Let's say you have type 2 diabetes. Probably 70 to 80% of Americans now has either prediabetes or diabetes. That's a sobering statistic. But the idea that our systemic metabolism is affecting our brain's destiny is a lot to embrace.
It is. It is. Wow. I mean, it's just, I'm so glad you're writing another book about this because I'm incredibly interested to learn more
I'm
about
so
the
glad I am too.
microglial.
It's a good exercise.
Yes.
It,
And you're definitely not getting a Lifetime Achievement Award before the book because we have to
no,
wait till
okay,
after the
get it
book.
ready. And then you're going to, whether I get it or not will depend on the quality of the book, I guess. But, this relationship to metabolism over which we have control in the context, let's go back to Parkinson's.
Right.
I mean, I think there's a lot of understanding out there that metabolic health affects the brain in the context of Alzheimer's. Having said that, the notion of it being something at play as it relates to Parkinson's, I think, is a bit of a eyebrow raiser for a lot of
No, it
people.
is.
I think back to the spring of this year in the New England Journal of Medicine was a fascinating study published that looked at an intervention to improve metabolism in Parkinson's patients. We're going to give these patients an intervention that's going to help them with their metabolism, help them with their blood sugar, the way cells use energy, the way they produce various substances based upon what they receive. And what they gave these individuals over a 1-year period of time and had a control group as well that did not receive the intervention was a GLP-1 agonist drug, an Ozempic-like drug given to patients with Parkinson's disease.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, what did it show? The control group had a progressive decline in function as measured on what is called the UPDRS, Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, which is a standardized way that we look at Parkinson's patients in terms of mobility, their ability to carry out their activities of daily living, how much assistance they need, et cetera. That number generally with time goes higher and higher. In the group receiving the GLP-1 agonist drug, Parkinson's was stopped dead in its tracks.
That's incredible.
It is.
And this is a direct relationship to the metabolic health of the brain cells. It's not, people think of semaglutide and the GLPs as a weight loss drug, right? And I'm sure a person's weight has something to do with the positive effects, but this is more of a direct effect of the GLP on the brain. What do you think?
Okay, okay. I'm glad that you turned it into a question because, as a statement, who knows? I mean, who knows if weight loss? But they didn't lose a lot of weight. I mean, generally, Parkinson's patients are a bit on the thin side.
Right.
There wasn't a massive weight loss a significant weight loss in these individuals. So, interesting thought. Why you went there probably was because we know that overweight and obesity is associated with significantly higher level of inflammatory chemicals that are measurable in the blood. The tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin 1 beta, interleukin 6, et cetera, which we've seen in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and across the spectrum of the neurodegenerative conditions to varying degrees. But I think when we look at the research that shows a direct effect on mitochondrial function when these drugs are utilized, as was demonstrated in diabetic patients, a significant improvement of mitochondrial function. It's where the money is, by the way. That's more likely the explanation. I mean, Parkinson's disease is a disease of the mitochondria. We know that the mitochondria are immediately damaged when the experimental chemicals are given to rodents and primates to cause Parkinson's in them. These are mitochondrial toxins. And therefore, the focus is on upregulating or enhancing the mitochondria, how they work. That's what metabolism is all about. And that's one of the ways which these GLP-1 agonist drugs work, which probably is responsible for a lot more of their activity peripherally in terms of their improvement in metabolism than is being given credit for.
That's true.
So that said, this is a breathtaking result. I want to make very clear to your viewers that I'm not saying that if mom or dad or you have Parkinson's, go out and start taking Ozempic or other GLP-1 agonists. I will say that that's not what these drugs are approved for, number one. Number two, this was one study, a year-long study. And number three, there was a significant number of side effects in the treatment arm of this study. Around 40% or more had significant gastrointestinal issues, which is not uncommon, as with the other GLP-1 agonist drugs as well. Liraglutide was the one that was used. Victoza is the trade
Victoza.
name of the one used in the study. And I will indicate where our story gets even more exciting and where we will, then take this validation of metabolism is that this summer, in the Alzheimer's Association International Conference, there was a presentation by a researcher who carried out a similar study on Alzheimer's patients and showed in the 3-year study using the same GLP-1 agonist, liraglutide, that the rate of loss of brain substance in established Alzheimer's patients, the shrinkage of the brain was reduced in the treatment group by 50%, with a significantly reduced rate of cognitive decline. Yes, there were side effects, but there weren't side effects like are being seen with the currently FDA-approved so-called Alzheimer's drugs
Right.
of brain hemorrhage and brain shrinkage
Right.
seen in virtually across the board in people receiving these drugs that are approved for treating Alzheimer's disease. So, again, my mission in these two examples in our conversation today is not to indicate this is the way we should go moving forward, though it may be. We'll see what the approval process looks like. But it's to really shine a light on targeting metabolism.
Absolutely.
That's what these drugs are doing. And you and I know, and your audience from listening to you, and all your patients know now, that there are a heck of a lot of things out there that we can be doing right now to improve our metabolism, as opposed to injecting ourselves with the drug every day.
Exactly. And I think the GLPs are just indicating metabolism is at the root of all of these brain diseases. And so it's just an indicator of mitochondrial health. It's an indicator of metabolic disease as a root cause of these problems. And so if we're focused on metabolic disease, preferably earlier in life, but as I want to highlight too, it's never too late to turn things around.
And it's never too early.
Yeah, and it's never too early as well. I mean, just to highlight on that point, I can't tell you the number of teenagers that we're seeing that have a hemoglobin A1C of 5.7, indicating poor glucose metabolism. And so I got my kids started very early on understanding metabolic health. In fact, we talk about it at breakfast once in a while, is their metabolism and how they can affect their metabolism
Some people may think
positively.
that's strange, but you're looking out for them. My breakfast lessons growing up were, strange neurological diseases. And I remember one, it actually was dinner. My father said, "I want to tell you about Marcia Fava Bignami syndrome." What in the hell is that? I was, how old? I don't know, 11 years old. Well, what's that one going to be, Dad?
Yeah.
I had to go there because he dedicated himself to medicine, so I didn't get a heck of a lot
What
of
type
time.
of physician was he?
Neurosurgery.
He was also a neurosurgeon. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I didn't get a lot of time, and so I had to really be on his turf. And Marcia Fava Bignami syndrome. There's not one of your viewers, I think, who's, unless they're in the field.
I don't know. I haven't even heard of that one.
It's shrinkage of the corpus callosum due to drinking red wine in Italian men.
Interesting.
I know it's way out there, but the point
Yeah.
is that as you're talking metabolism with your kids, I remember those days.
Yeah, my dad also was a physician. He told me all about the man who mistook his wife for a hat. Do you remember that book?
Oliver Sacks.
Oliver Sacks. Yeah.
Absolutely.
He loved that book, and we would talk about that all the time. And then, like you said, the imaging then kind of, I would say, pushed that entire kind of diagnostic pathway under the rug a little bit, because now you just get an MRI and you can tell what's going on.
Oh, as far as as that, but again, I'm buoyed by the notion that there seems to be a bit of a groundswell in neurology
There is.
to look at lifestyle. I mean, those articles are there, those studies are there. They're generally ignored, but even in the throwaway journals. I was reading a throwaway journal last week. I think it's called Neurology Reviews. There's some interesting things, and they were talking about how there are a couple of neurologists who've established themselves on social media and trying to get information out.
Sure.
And then I was reading about in this article the number of followers that I have, and they interviewed me, and I had forgotten about the interview, and they asked, "Why do you do it?" And I said, "Because we've got to get this information out, and social media is a great tool for getting information out, for empowering people to make better decisions in terms of their lifestyle choices. let me go back to where we were just a moment ago, because
Sure.
there's a thought still hanging, and that is, so these issues are important 20 to 30 years prior to the onset of
Right.
Alzheimer's. When does the Alzheimer's prevention program begin? Then, in your 20s, in your 30s, you said teens having higher A1Cs, adolescents, toddlers, newborns, during
Prior to birth,
pregnancy,
right? Exactly.
during gestation, rather, and I would say, yeah,
Yeah,
even pre-gestation.
sure.
I did an interview yesterday on a podcast. We were talking about the method of birth and the implications of
Yeah.
whether a child is brought into this world via vaginal delivery or cesarean section, and the implications that that has on that child's brain health
Right.
and immune function, based upon whether that child is anointed with specific bacteria and viruses by passing through the birth canal, or is delivered by C-section and is exposed to those organisms on the surgeon's gloves at the time of birth, knowing that mother did receive a blast of IV antibiotics prior to the C-section. Again, I'm not saying C-sections are a bad thing. They're life-saving, valuable tool, but I believe a little bit overdone. And I think the discussion with soon-to-be parents needs to go further than the length of the C-section scar, that having a C-section may indeed have lifelong implications for that individual in terms of his or her immune function and even brain function.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, a lot of women, when they ask me about what method of delivery, and a lot of people, especially here in LA, I think a C-section is preferred now as a method of delivery, and they do scheduled C-sections a lot of
Right.
time.
Convenient.
Convenience, right? It's all about convenience, timing, and actually the OBGYNs actually prefer it now too, because it's less stressful for them to do a C-section than to deal with a breech birth or a birth issue. And so it's kind of interesting to see how things have gone with modern medicine. But we always talk about doing a vaginal wipe of the baby to at least get the vaginal microflora to the baby, because a lot of, like you said, the mothers getting C-sections are getting a dose of antibiotics, and the baby is not exposed to the vaginal canal at all. And so that's one of the ways that they're
You
looking
ought
at
to
it.
restate that. I mean,
Yeah.
because that's really very, very important. That
Yes.
is something that is almost unknown. I wrote about it in Brainmaker, but what you just said is really quite profound. That's
Right.
research from NYU. Maria Dominguez Lopez Bello, I think is her name, and she said, if we're delivering babies via C-section, we'll put a swab in the birth canal
Yeah.
ahead of time, keep it warm and moist, and then when the baby's delivered, we'll swab his or her face, mouth, nose, ears, eyes with these bacteria,
Right.
inoculate that child for a healthier microbiome.
Right.
Because when it doesn't happen, and the microbiome is formed from the other bacteria, after a period of time, 18 months or so, there's pretty minimal difference between the two. But we do know that rates for autoimmune conditions like type 1 diabetes and celiac disease are significantly higher in C-section children.
Exactly.
That's science. And why is it happening? Is it just, what is the correlation? Is it causative? Well, we have a really profound mechanism now that we understand the role that the gut bacteria and other organisms are
Absolutely.
playing in the regulating what's called the set point of the immune system. Not enough immunity, or at risk for disease of the infectious type. Too much immunity, very simplified. You react against your own body. We have an autoimmune condition. So that set point is really fundamentally important for keeping us in the Goldilocks zone, in the sweet spot. And, so many of the perturbations of our gut bacteria that we are exposed to these days, primarily the foods that we eat, but the antibiotics and other medications we receive, change the diversity and function of these bacteria, and the immune system functions, and as a consequence, the brain is compromised.
Exactly. And it's profound research, like you said, and it's incredible how slow research actually makes its way into mainstream practice. And so doing what you do on social media and also on podcasts and just spreading the word, hopefully more doctors are also listening to your podcast, this podcast, and they're learning these things because the research is there. I mean, it is definitely there, and it's not woo-woo science. That these are some of the practices we should be following. There's this big push in medicine that I've heard ever since I was in medical school called standard of care, right?
Yeah.
The problem with standard of care is it gets locked in and then it's not changed for 20 to 30 years at many institutions when it should be.
Yeah. There's a word that people use to describe what I was doing. They said, "Oh, what Dr. Perlmutter does is unconventional, and he's breaking with tradition, And I thought, well, tradition sort of connotes long standing, and this idea of segregating body parts and
Right.
targeting disease and not nurturing wellness is really brand new.
Uh-huh.
I mean, those involved in healthcare have always tried to nurture health
Right.
until quite recently.
Right.
And again, the medical aspect of health is the scientific aspect viewpoint on health. In many ways, is exciting and wonderful, but in other ways, kinds of locks us into being reactive, not proactive.
Right. Right. Absolutely. On that, I wanted to spend a little bit of time for the listeners. One of the big things I love to talk about in this podcast is a Pareto principle, the 20% of the information that makes 80% of the difference. Because I think people get really overwhelmed with the massive amount of information that they hear, that they're getting presented by. And, I don't know if you agree, but I think that there's some big wins that you can have. And you detail this in another one of your books, the Grain Brain Whole Life Plan. And I would love to just kind of hear from you your current thought process around what are the big wins in brain health right now? If someone were to ask you, what are the top 5 things that I can do right now to live a brain healthy lifestyle? What would you recommend to people?
Exercise would be
Yeah.
on probably, as well as nutrition, but
Mhm.
underrated and a powerful lever to pull.
Mhm.
And we can spend some time talking about that. But
Please, yeah.
well,
And
this is
specifically, like what type of exercise and how much?
well, we know that muscles that are what come into play when you're exercising are actually endocrine glands. They are
Right.
secreting a variety of chemicals, cathepsin B, eresin, BDNF, that have effects throughout the body, not the least of which are affecting the brain. And therefore, if you want to have chemicals that are good for the brain, you can produce them by activating this endocrine gland. An endocrine gland is an organ in the body that creates messengers that affect the function of another part of the body. The thyroid gland creates thyroid hormone that has an effect on the muscles, on the heart, and the brain, etc. So people understand what an endocrine gland is. To conceive of muscles being an endocrine gland is a bit of a stretch, but that's what's going on.
Mhm.
And the textbooks are written that describe the effects of exercise and the chemicals it creates
Yeah.
on the brain. It's there, it's low-hanging fruit, it's for everyone, but you have to buy some very expensive piece of machinery. And this is the pitch for everybody. A new pair of, I used to call them sneakers, but what do you call them now? I don't know. But
Trainers or
yeah, you don't
whatever,
need to be equipment heavy
Right.
and have a expensive gym membership and a personal trainer. Just get out and walk.
Exactly.
Get your heart rate up.
Yeah.
We often try to delineate between what we call resistance exercise, which means basically straining a
Sure.
muscle as opposed to aerobic exercise, which is more cardiovascular, which is getting your heart rate up. I think that we can look at some broad stroke recommendations in terms of your heart rate, which you can metricize based on wearing your Apple Watch or Fitbit or whatever you choose, but start to get to know that along with your blood glucose level and maybe even parameters related to sleep. But get your heart rate up for 20 minutes of a period of time. And what should the target heart rate be? I can't make a general recommendation. This is very personalized approach, but as a really broad general view, but consult your physician, 180 minus your age. That's a ballpark. It might be a lower number if you're on a medication like a beta blocker. It might be a higher number if you're really in good shape. But just as a starting place. And everybody can start today.
Yes.
If you make it a rule to walk to the mailbox and turn around and come back to your house every day, tomorrow do it twice.
Right.
If you can do it, you could likely do it twice. There's got to be something that you can do. And if there is, probably a little bit more.
Right.
So this is a tonic. This is a brain tonic. It's creating what's getting a lot of attention and has for the past 15 years, BDNF, brain-derived
Yes.
neurotrophic hormone factor. And this is a chemical that is what we call a trophic factor that just does wonderful things for neurons and synapses and stimulates the growth of new brain cells. I mean, who knew? In when I was in medical school, if you would have said, yes, there's a factor that, well, you would have said even that the brain grows new brain cells, I would have been kicked out of med school.
Right.
So, it took a long time for it. We saw it in rodents, we saw it in primates, but the idea that humans could grow new brain cells was really just very countercultural at the time, really broke with tradition.
Right.
That was the term they used about me. It's non-traditional.
Non-traditional.
Yeah. What is our tradition? Our tradition is to nurture health. Anyhow, so that's really very important. The next
So
on the list,
you're saying either getting out there and do some aerobic exercise or strength training.
both.
And do both.
Yeah,
Okay.
and beyond the brain, there's a lot of other benefits to strength training and mobility, flexibility. And that's the third pillar that often gets ignored, and that is flexibility. The reason I think it's important is that when you're doing flexibility, you're ultimately offloading damage risk. So if you're flexible, you're not going to as likely hurt yourself, pull a muscle, do this and the other, which then leads you to not exercise because you're injured. So we all get injured doing our sports, and then you're out. You can't be playing pickleball for a week or two because you twisted your ankle.
Yeah.
You got to be careful. So I think the flexibility and the balance part are really very important.
Yeah. Very true.
That's how I start my workout is with flexibility and balance.
Yes.
And then aerobics and then weights or machines. As I'm traveling, most of the hotels don't have a lot of free weights. They have a lot of machines. There's some really good machines these days that are smooth and give you, really great control over the amount of weight that you're using. And I can't then overstate the importance of avoiding what everyone's talking about, this ultra processed foods that, became a thing in the mid 1960s when food manufacturers, let me stop there, food manufacturers. What a term.
Right.
Manufacturing food coming from a factory. What is that? Anyway, entered the marketplace and the lexicon that these foods are, a good way to spike your blood sugar very quickly, as well as being devoid of important nutrients like fiber, like vitamins and minerals, etc. But they're just vacuous as it relates to what they're doing for you nutritionally. And they're a really negative, a profound negative impact on the gut bacteria. We've talked about why that's important. That's not what they need. That's not what your bacterial friends need.
Right.
They need real food. They need fiber. I really feel like, fiber should be considered the fourth macronutrient.
Sure.
Can't be because it's a carbohydrate, so falls into that category. And unfortunately, because it's a carbohydrate, people go low carb, they go low fiber.
They do.
Bad mistake. But that said, it's avoiding what foods in you are going to raise your blood sugar. So that might be a different recommendation for you as opposed to me. We are different genetically, we're different physiologically. We know the broad strokes. We know what that meal is that's going to spike our blood sugar, even without a continuous glucose monitor. And that's bad for the brain. So, but again, get a CGM and find out. For me, it was cashews. Who knew?
Yeah.
Cashews did a number on my blood sugar. I wasn't prepared for that. And I repeated it. And sure enough, so go easy on the cashews, go easy on the fruit. The fruit bowl, I ordered a fruit bowl yesterday at our hotel. It was enough for an elephant.
Yeah.
So when I ate a little bit of it, and then the waiter was really surprised I didn't want to take it with me. You could box this up anyway.
The serving sizes are just gotten massive in the last few decades.
It's so true. And otherwise, you feel like you're not getting your money's worth, And the restaurant determines portion size. That's what's on the plate. I should eat the whole thing because, you don't want to leave it. The third thing is to eat more fat. Now, that really sounds countercultural, doesn't it? But, to be sure, we're talking about, the incredible need for good fat to build a better brain. Your brain, by dry weight, is 70% fat. You need those good fats, those good omega-3s to structurally and functionally improve your brain. And avoid the bad fats. Maybe another conversation. I think people know where to go to learn this information. My website, Dr. Georgia Eads, there's so many out there. And that, I think, is really important because we're trying to undo the damage done in the 1970s and 80s and beyond that castigated dietary fat. Eat more good fat. Get
Right.
good olive oil. Take it with you to the restaurant. It's strange, I know, but so am I. So that's important. And I think finally, it is to eat more of a plant-based diet. I am not a vegetarian or vegan. I eat animal products, but have a lot of plants with your meal, and they should be of varying colors to really accentuate your exposure to the good things that are in vegetables, the polyphenols, the bioflavonoids that so much science has supported as being really helpful for your gut bacteria, and then secondarily for you, and also primarily for you through various mechanisms as well.
Right.
So those are the pillars:
Big pillars, yeah.
exercise, ultra-processed food avoidance, and all the foods that are spiking your blood sugar, eating good fat, and having a colorful plate. When you do that and you load your plate like that, you're going to start to see the word Mediterranean kind of flashing in the background, because that's kind of what the Mediterranean diet is really all about, though the term has been bastardized these days. But those are really the things we should focus on.
Yeah, it's one of the most studied diets, and it doesn't mean you have to go just start eating Greek food only, but it's just following the pattern of the Mediterranean diet, which is high in vegetables, some good fats. They promote fats from fish and nuts, and then finally the some well-sourced protein that's not processed. I think if you eat in that pattern, not only is it brain healthy, it's healthy for every single system in your body.
Getting back to what we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a combination. And then I think also a couple more things that you probably agree with as well is protecting your brain. I think, we talked a little bit earlier about CTE, but it's also important for people that don't play football. I think protecting your brain. What are your thoughts around that?
Oh, it's a very good point.
Right.
And, we think, well, football players are banging their heads all day, especially the linemen, and, that's what they do throughout the entire game. And it's these repeated head traumas that cause a problem. Well, one bad head trauma is devastating for your brain.
Right.
Even if you think you've recovered, a lot of what goes on is irreparable and may even continue to worsen over time. And I think I give a lot of credit to our friend Daniel Amen,
Sure.
who's really made it clear that the brain is so delicate, as he's demonstrated on his SPECT scanning, that we've got to do everything to protect our brains, i.e., wear a helmet when you're on your bike.
Sure.
You may be really a good bicyclist, or it's just a cruiser bike you're going around the neighborhood, but what about that bad driver or somebody who on their cell phone makes a mistake? You're the one. They're not going to care. I mean, I'm not going to care. They're not going to suffer any damage because it's just their car.
Right.
But you've traumatized your brain. So I think that's a point well taken.
Yeah, it's a long, and like you mentioned earlier, that damage keeps going and going for maybe years, or we don't even know how long.
Well, how does that happen?
It's the metabolism, right?
Yeah. So you've wondered,
Right.
gee, you're falling asleep at night. Well, why is it then that this continues?
Right.
Why do they get worse with time?
Right.
If you have Parkinson's because you were exposed to an environmental insult and the insult has gone away, why do you now have a progressive disease?
It's a great question.
It's a great question. I've pondered it for a long time,
No,
and now I understand it.
no. You answered it for me today, actually.
And what happens is that trauma, that environmental exposure, that metabolic issue changes those helpful microglial cells, the M2 cells, into the evil twin, into the M1 damaging cell. That takes over control. And now that's running the show, destabilizing neuronal connections, the synapses, leading to neurons to undergo pre-programmed cell death, apoptosis, all the bad things, right?
Sure.
Here's the empowerment part. When you target their metabolism, when you target their mitochondria, you can shift them back to being the good twin and stop the process. How can I say that? Remember the Parkinson's study that was released in the spring of this year.
Right.
They arrested Parkinson's, a chronic progressive neurodegenerative disorder. That's how it's characterized.
Right.
It's chronic and it's progressive. It worsens with time. No more.
Yeah. I think it's such an important fact to highlight is all of these diseases that we thought, first of all, they come up as a surprise, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. People are surprised when they get them. They don't need to be a surprise because you can start working on preventing them 30 years ahead of time. But also, they're I think the general mindset of the public is they're not treatable and they are going to progress, and you'll probably die of this now. And what an incredible time we live in when it's reversal is what we're talking about
Yeah.
now.
I'm, flying out here. I'm working on my book, and it's
Yeah.
only a number of months until I get that word out. And
I can't wait.
I was excited about Grain Brain and the other books. I'm just over the top here, and on this book. And again, I hope that I take my lumps for it. I hope I get the criticism,
Yeah.
because that's good. It means I've ruffled some feathers, and it is absolutely time that people recognize two important concepts: A, that a lot of the stuff is reversible,
Mhm.
and B, that they are running the ship. They're determining the outcome of the war that's gone on in their
Right.
brains. That's a thesis I'm really going to amplify, and you're going to hear a lot more about it. But it's a time when, being able to take advantage of podcasts, of social media,
Mhm.
of the exposure that we are free to express
Right.
and appear on, that people can tune into this information and gain a level of empowerment beyond the so-called status quo. Ronald Reagan famously said that status quo is a Latin term that means the mess we're in. It doesn't mean that, but we're in a mess
kind
as
of
it
is,
relates to
right.
healthcare, and people like you are showing people there is another way.
Right.
That some people see things as they are and ask why, and others see things as they can be and say why not.
Mhm.
So it's a good time for people who are looking at these opportunities to really bring about a change in healthcare.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm incredibly optimistic, and I really, truly, from the bottom of my heart, appreciate the work that you've done and are doing, because, just getting people to change their mindset about these things is a massive shift in our culture. And then just righting the ship a little bit today, that adds up to you sail boats a lot, right? If you sail the ship 1 degree different
Over time.
is going to make a massive change. I think that's what's happening right now.
I will probably take that from you and use that. That's good.
Absolutely. You
I like
can.
that. Yeah. I will say, and there's a bit of a flight of idea here. We had dinner at your house
Yes.
several months ago, and as we were leaving, we got in the car. I said to my wife about you,
Mm.
he's a really nice guy.
Oh, thank you.
And why I'm bringing it up right now, I don't know, because I'm feeling it,
Oh,
and I really honor your dedication to
thank you.
this. And it's evident, and it's important, and it's great that there are people like you on the team. It's really encouraging.
Thank you. It's a hard road to change how medicine is practiced and how healthcare is administered in our current environment in America. But it's just so incredibly just inspirational for me to sit across from you and Casey Means and other people that are just making massive shifts in culture right now. And I think this is the beginning of sailing that ship in the right direction. And we're trying to develop a whole new healthcare system that's focused on health, not on disease. And I think it's going to happen. I really do. And so with that, I just truly appreciate this. And thank you so much for
Oh,
coming.
my pleasure.
and
Thank you
making
so
this
much.
happen. This was a great conversation. And I can't wait to do it again with you, to be honest. I hope you'll come back after this next book, because I just can't wait to dive deep into that.
Count me in.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Perlmutter.